Ernie Ray, and this is the Beyond Belief podcast. In this week's programme, which marks the 70th anniversary of Indian independence, we're discussing the legacy of R.B. Ambedkar. He was the prime author of India's constitution. He took a very different approach to Mahatma Gandhi, and he spent his life fighting for the rights of the untouchables. Joining me were the anti-caste campaigner Santosh Das, the historian William Gould, and the academic Ananya Vajpayee. I began by asking Ananya to assess Ambedkar's significance.
He was at least as significant as Mahatma Gandhi, but he hasn't gotten his due, I'm afraid.
And Santosh?
It's a sense and scale of the human justice that he was proposing. What he did in his lifetime has transformed the lives of untold millions of people, men and women. And he's just a world-class figure, and that's why he's very significant.
William, the comparison has been made to Gandhi. How do you rate the two in terms of their significance for India?
Well, I think in the last 2 or 3 decades, Ambedkar has become a more significant figure in Indian politics. His influence has led to the transformation of Indian politics largely through the granting of agency to Dalit organisations and political organisations, which has totally changed the political landscape in India over the last 20 to 30 years.
The Dalits being the former untouchables.
Yes.
And Anya, let's go back to his background. He had very humble beginnings.
Yeah, Ambedkar himself belonged to an untouchable caste. He came from extreme poverty. He was only really able to get an education because his father and grandfather worked for the British Army. And he was very brilliant, and so he always found teachers and sponsors and patrons who took an interest in him as a student and helped him out with scholarships and opportunities. But the struggle to get an education for someone of his background was extremely difficult. And even as he continued to do very well and go on from school to college and college to university to finally, he ended up at Columbia, he had to encounter daily discrimination and a lot of personal setbacks throughout that journey.
Where did his political commitment start from, Santosh?
I think would be his experience of what he experienced, as a so-called untouchable, the inequalities that he experienced. When he was in the classroom, he was told that he'd have to drink from a different vessel. And if that vessel wasn't there, and that vessel was basically just like a little pitcher, and they'd pour the water basically into his hands and from a distance, and he would drink, and so would maybe 1 or 2 of the other untouchable children there as well. And if there wasn't a vessel for him to drink from, then he would remain thirsty throughout the day. He experienced extreme discrimination when it came to teachers even examining or assessing his homework. They wouldn't touch his books.
Ananya?
I just wanted to add that, he wanted to study Sanskrit. It's not just question of food and water and physical matters like that. But the fact that at a certain level, when he was entering college, he wanted to study Sanskrit as a subject. And he wasn't allowed to do that because Sanskrit was supposedly prohibited to, people who were outcast. But it was his experiences of discrimination that led him to conclude that there was just no way for somebody of his qualifications who could be a leader of his community to then wash his hands of the political problems confronting that community.
So was he committed to non-violence?
He wasn't, he didn't have an elaborate philosophy of non-violence in the way that Gandhi had. He was willing to try Gandhian methods of protest at a certain early stage in his political career. So he was willing to try civil disobedience. He was willing to try, a boycott, various forms of mass protest, which were essentially non-violent. But he was not in it for the non-violence per se, if you see what I mean.
Pragmatic decision, William.
Yes, I think it was probably quite difficult to ignore the political techniques of Gandhi in the 1920s. And it's really, I think, in that decade, in particular, that Ambedkar started to develop much more strongly as a leader of untouchable movements and organisations and parties. Through that decade, his involvement with Gandhian practices such as satyagraha, civil disobedience, non-violence, were probably, really a reflection of the fact that at that time that was seen as a kind of very effective mode of mass mobilisation, rather than necessarily Ambedkar himself following, Gandhi deeply through that kind of philosophy of non-violence.
But I think what was really, really different about Dr. Ambedkar was that he felt that in order to be able to get the justice and, the support for his people was through his education and his contacts and being able to, articulate what it is that his community needed. And I think, his pen was more powerful than any of the protests.
William.
The big argument that Ambedkar had with Gandhi around caste, which obviously went over a long period of time, but its most important moment probably was in 1932, around the time of what was known as the Pune Pact.
We'd better just clarify, this was a series of conferences which the British had with Indian representatives, including Congress and Gandhi, where they discussed the way ahead.
Yeah, and in the Round Table conferences of the early 1930s, the British were proposing separate electorates for what were described as depressed classes or untouchables. And Ambedkar was a big advocate of this form of affirmative action, electorates for untouchables where only untouchables would vote for untouchable candidates. Gandhi was very much opposed to this idea because he felt that untouchables should be seen as part of the Hindu fold. And that kind of underpinned the different philosophical position of the two leaders, whereas Gandhi felt that untouchability wasn't integral to Hinduism, it could be reformed out of Hinduism. Ambedkar thought that untouchability was integral to Hinduism and that caste itself had to be totally destroyed.
And Ananya, he said, "I will not die a Hindu."
Yes, he said that eventually in 1935. So it took him some years to understand that there was no way to vindicate the system. You had to junk the whole thing.
Santosh, how did that decision of Ambedkar go down at the time among the Hindu communities?
There were some people, high caste Hindus, who wanted to reform Hinduism. But what we were having was this resistance from very orthodox Hindus who were saying, no, things will carry on the way they are. And that if you're an untouchable, you remain an untouchable throughout your lifetime and your descendants will be untouchables. And there's no flexibility of movement.
Ananya, is there significance in the different terms used by Gandhi and Ambedkar when it came to talking about untouchables?
Yes, absolutely. And I think that difference is absolutely crucial. So Gandhi used the term Harijan, which means a person or a child of God. We are all equal in the eyes of God. That's the idea there. So to refer to the lowest of the low as being the children of God confers on them a certain dignity, a certain sense of equality, and a certain kind of idea of almost Christian love that Gandhi wanted to put out there. The term Dalit is the term used by Ambedkar and followers of Ambedkar. Now, Dalit literally means crushed or ground down. And when you use the term Dalit, you're emphasizing the anger that is felt by those who've been oppressed for centuries and the resistance that comes up as a result of that anger of inequality, of being treated as unequal. So the two kinds of political emotion that attach to these two terms, those are absolutely central in capturing the political difference between Gandhi and Ambedkar.
I think there's a couple of contextual points that's worth pointing out here as to how Ambedkar seems so radical and why he was so rejected, as it were, by Gandhi's followers. And that was firstly that there were other untouchable movements at the time, the early 20th century, that were probably more, as it were, favourable to a Gandhian ideology, which wanted to maybe emulate or raise their status within the caste hierarchy, within the Hindu fold, as it were. So I think that's the first thing to bear in mind. So Ambedkar was presenting a very radical position in challenging Hinduism at this time. And the second point is that I think there was a kind of drive around the 1910s and 1920s to represent the Hindu community as a larger community as possible, because there was a kind of communal competition going on within colonial India between Hindu organisations and Muslim organisations too. So there was a politics of religion going on here, in which untouchables were, as it were, the kind of pawns in this kind of larger communal game too. And I think probably there were organisations of the Hindu right, which in a sense Gandhi played into, that were trying to get untouchables represented as Hindus too. So I think that's the other factor here. There was a kind of strong political agenda. I
want just very briefly to fast forward to after the Second World War, when it became absolutely clear that the battle for Indian independence had been won. The whole process was brought forward by Lord Mountbatten, which meant that when independence was declared, there was no constitution. And Ambedkar played a major role in writing the constitution. I just want to quote one or two little things. He said, "The state shall not discriminate against any citizen on grounds only of religion, race, caste, sex, place of birth, or any of them." And he declared, "Untouchability is abolished and its practice in any form is forbidden." That's strong stuff, William.
Yes, I think the Constitution of India is a unique document in being strongly a social document. It's quite socially revolutionary in some respects. It's got one of the earliest forms of affirmative action that we can see anywhere in the world. And Ambedkar's role in that, I think, is particularly important in the sense that he was able to put into the Constitution elements that obliged the state to take action in terms of statutory guarantees of the civic rights of what were known as scheduled castes and scheduled tribes at that time. So it established for the post-colonial Indian state a system of what was known as reservations, in which eventually we see an entire, as it were, political change in India based around, as it were, the promotion of the rights of those communities.
Well, let me remind you that you're listening to Beyond Belief, and today we're looking at the life and legacy of B.R. Ambedkar, the Indian political reformer who drafted the Indian Constitution and spent his life campaigning for the untouchables. What is his legacy? How far does modern-day India live up to the principles he espoused? And with me are Santosh Das, William Gould and Ananya Vajpayee. Peter Oswald was writer-in-residence at Shakespeare's Globe Theatre in London. He's written a play about Ambedkar, which has just completed a short run at the RADA Festival. I asked him what drew him to the Ambedkar story.
It's an incredibly powerful story. You don't get lower in the kind of social heap than the untouchables, and you don't hear many stories of suffering over centuries, maybe thousands of years worse than theirs. And yet out of the midst of them emerges this great champion, this amazingly learned, incredibly principled man who struggles with his whole life to get them some political rights.
So what is the key climactic moment of the play?
I guess the key emotional moment of the play towards the end is when Ambedkar converts to Buddhism, having encountered the Buddha along his journey and throughout his struggles. And he leads 500,000 followers in one go into Buddhism. So it's a tremendous moment in history, really.
And how do you portray that in the play?
We portray it through all the emotions that have built up. And there are two characters who are, as it were, sidekicks of Ambedkar, who comment, sometimes in a comic way, on the progression of the action and what Ambedkar might be thinking. And they're very much telling the audience what's happening. And then we have, just as Ambedkar makes his vows, and he made his own special vows renouncing any belief in the Hindu gods, we were lucky to have an amazing dancer in our company, and he plays the Hindu goddess Kali, and she comes on and trying to draw Ambedkar back, and he manages to hold himself together and hold to what he's decided to do. He then, as he's converted to Buddhism, in our play, he collapses and dies. In reality, he died about 5 weeks later, but it was the culminating act of his life, for sure.
Does that not suggest to you that he left it right to the last minute because he was unprepared to face up to the consequences, the social consequences of leaving Hinduism?
I think that Ambedkar wasn't afraid of anything. He was a very deep thinking man and incredibly learned, and he didn't rush into things.
So what has Ambedkar's life left you with? What's been the impact on you personally?
Well, I'm very impressed to find a completely practical, rigorous thinking politician and economist who also has a profound belief in the crucialness of spirituality to a society. And Ambedkar alerted me to the possibly very profound link between politics and spirituality, which has been lost in our country and is corrupted and perverted in many other countries. And the common sense thing might be to say there can't be any relationship really between politics and religion, but I think Ambedkar shows a way that a kind of individual spirituality where the individual is being transformed in the direction of being able to be a more social being, I think that's incredibly inspiring. And so, yeah, I guess in my thinking I'm led to think work in our society?
That was Peter Oswald. And Santosh, I know you've seen the play. Did you like it?
I thought it was excellent. Peter had been working on it for about 10 years, I hear. And it's a very sensitively written play, a very powerful play. And for me, as someone who's promoting the legacy of Dr. Ambedkar here in the UK, the play is getting the message of Dr. Ambedkar's struggle, with his untouchability, but also the freedom struggle and, the social activism, and then the work he did on the Constitution. All of that is actually covered in the play, alongside, of course, converting to Buddhism. So I really welcome it.
I want to discuss that conversion to Buddhism, William. Why do you think he chose Buddhism? He had a whole host of religions he could have turned to. And in fact, he at one time asked the question, should it be Buddha or Marx?
Yes. I think the decision to convert to Buddhism was something that happened gradually over a period of time, starting with the kind of early contacts with Buddhist leaders in the 1910s and some pivotal ones in the mid-1930s. In the end, probably the other possible alternatives at that time, as it were, for conversion of Dalits or untouchables would have been Sikhism or Christianity. There's much more to it than this, but in both of those traditions, it was felt that Dalits would in some cases maintain certain kinds of social inequalities and disabilities, whereas Buddhism presented a form of social equality, as he saw it, that was really an opportunity to reject everything that he saw that was wrong with Hinduism. You mentioned Marx there and socialism. I think for Ambedkar, he made this comparison between the kind of revolution that one might see in a social revolution for socialists with the sort of revolution that he thought might work in India. And he felt that, I think, that it wasn't all just about property. It was about how we need to overcome the inequalities inherent within religious culture as much as within the question of property. And so I think he saw Buddhism as an ideal tradition in which that might be achieved.
And Anya, as I put it to Peter, he did leave it very late, some weeks before his death, before he actually plucked up the courage to...
No, it wasn't like that, really. He was very, very sick. He was diabetic. And he was just, he just died. Literally, he finished this gigantic volume he wrote called The Buddha and His Dhamma and collapsed and died. And he was in terrible health for those last few years of his life. So he was sort of racing against time. In fact, Sangha Rakshita writes that, Time's winged chariot was standing by his sick bed and he was writing this Buddhist Bible, as he called it.
But I suppose the big question that I'm struggling with is for him, was conversion to Buddhism an absolute commitment to a specific form of spirituality, or was it a religious tool which he felt he could use in his struggle to get equality for untouchables?
I think there were three things at work. There was an elimination of other options. There was also a desire to cleave to one of the great religious traditions of the world, which would give a kind of autonomous existence and prestige to the new converts, right? They were attaching themselves to a very old and hoary tradition. And the third thing, the really important thing, was the centrality of suffering to the Buddhist doctrine. Because for him, suffering was a function of social inequality. So embracing a system that put suffering at the center of a quest for a better society and for human liberation, human emancipation, that was the ideal choice.
So William, pragmatism or spiritual conviction?
Yes, well, I think there is a kind of pragmatism to the idea of conversion to a tradition in which, if you can convert in one go, as he did, 400,000 or so untouchables to Buddhism, and when the total population of the Buddhist community in India, today is something like 8 million or so, then you're talking about being able to, as it were, own almost or control a tradition in some respects, a certain aspect of it. So I think there are forms of pragmatism there.
Santosh, this is an extraordinary figure, 400,000, maybe 500,000 converted all in one go. How has that affected Buddhism in India? Has it changed the nature of Buddhism?
Yes, it's created a new kind of Buddhism, an Ambedkarite Buddhism, based on equality and being able to kind of achieve your full potential. And I think there was a report recently published about how Buddhists in India are doing comparatively well, compared to the rest of the population in education, in the male-female ratio, economically. So I think
they're still a tiny minority.
They're a tiny minority, but they're still doing very well, and I think that's a good sign, and that's why. Dr. Ambedkar felt, that Buddhism was about, training of the mind to make it act more righteously. And there was a scientific, sort of reason for kind of going to Buddhism, and that's why he did.
But how do mainstream Buddhists view his form of Buddhism? Do they embrace it?
Well, first of all, there are many sects and schools of Buddhism. And in India, Buddhism has been has been reduced to being quite minor, both numerically and philosophically, for well over 1,000 years. So the real question to ask is, how are Buddhists in Southeast Asia or in Sri Lanka or in Tibet, looking at, or in the Western world, looking at Ambedkarite Buddhists? And in that sense, I think Ambedkarite Buddhism is one of a whole series of Protestant and Reform Buddhist traditions which arise all over the world in the 20th century.
The truth of the matter is that worldwide, Buddhism's hardly mention Ambedkar. I've studied it in some detail, and I've never come across a single mention of him in terms of worldwide Buddhism.
And even in India, the count really kind of plateaued out at about 4 or 5 million in a couple of years after his death. And it never became the kind of raging social movement you would have expected. Perhaps it might have if he had stayed alive to provide the leadership. But it didn't do that. And I think, he took issue with some of the fundamental tenets of canonical Buddhism. So if you're going to start off in this radical way, it's not clear that any kind of orthodoxy or conservative faction is going to accept you anyway, right? His real purpose was to differentiate this new creed from the Hindu fold. And he said in those vows are equally divided between embracing Buddhism and rejecting Hinduism. There at least half the vows are, I will not do X, Y, and Z, rather than I will do X, Y, and Z, So in that sense, his Buddhism has remained somewhat on the margins of the conversation.
So if his impact on Buddhism has been fairly small, how do Hindus regard Ambedkar today? Has his legacy been recognised?
I think it's today quite impossible to not, as it were, celebrate Ambedkar at some level, at least to recognise the importance and his influence and his legacy. I certainly feel, however, that today there is a kind of strong reaction against Ambedkarites, as it were, organisations, parties and movements from the position of the Hindu right and from the position of high caste Hindus. And so there is a sort of a potentially quite problematic confrontation between those two kind of communities, as it were. And I think that the politics of caste reservations that underpins Ambedkarite politics, the kind of parties that follow, have benefited from that system.
Caste reservations being basically positive discrimination.
Yeah.
Certain jobs are left open only for those who come from lower castes.
Yes, and it's rejection of that politics that has been at the root of the rise of the Hindu right, for example.
Santosh.
What you see are a lot of leaders, the Prime Minister of India and others, who celebrate Dr. Ambedkar's birthday and appropriate him when it comes to, gathering the votes and so on. But what you get is also him being assigned essentially as the leader of the untouchables, and people don't recognise that actually, he was responsible for the constitution. He helped women in India. He had such an influence on so many different walks of life, not only social but economic, that helped all of India. And I think a lot of the time that's not recognised, and that's kind of quite sad. And, we were talking earlier about, the film Gandhi, for example, the late Richard Attenborough's film. And the film Gandhi doesn't even have a walk-on part as far as Ambedkar is concerned.
Some people have said that Narendra Modi has actually appropriated the legacy of Ambedkar. How so, William? How has he done that?
Well, I think the Hindu right organisations in different states of India have entered into electoral pacts with, for example, Dalit parties like the BSP in North India. And Modi is quite masterful in some ways in presenting himself as a kind of inheritor of a certain kind of tradition in late colonial, early post-colonial India. He's able to almost represent himself as it were, as somebody from a humble background who is able to sort of meet in the middle, as it were, some of the sort of politics of these organisations and parties that see themselves as Ambedkarite. But his own party, of course, is totally averse to the underpinning politics of Ambedkarite movements. And so I think there's a kind of a contradiction and a tension in all of that.
And Anya, it's got to be said, if you take the main motivation for his life, which was to do away with the caste system and provide equality for all, it's been a total failure.
You could look at this as a glass half full or as a glass half empty. You could say, why do we still need so much affirmative action? That means that those who were left behind are never going to catch up, and it's never going to be a truly equal society. But on the other hand, it also shows that no matter what the political ideology of the ruling party or the ruling coalition, no matter what the political conviction, which is at the moment front and center, thinking about inequality is something that every Indian government has to keep on doing.
I'd like to ask you one final question as we bring this programme to a close. How different do you think India would have been without Ambedkar, Santosh?
We wouldn't have definitely made the progress that we've made in India that Anya was talking about earlier. The reservations have helped uplift millions of people.
William?
Two things. Firstly, the Constitution of India, which is the biggest and most complex and most important constitution of its kind, with the most complex, as it were, provisions for social justice. That is very important to Indian politics today. And secondly, the ways in which Ambedkar gave agency to Dalit organisations to fight for their rights, their civic rights, through the late 20th century, early 21st century.
And Anya?
If you read the preamble to the Indian Constitution, you will notice that the word justice occurs before liberty and equality. So it was Ambedkar who was responsible for making social justice the first item of business for the new Indian nation. And I think we would be the poorer and less of a democracy were it not for his legacy.
Well, that's all for this week. My thanks to Santosh Das, William Gould and Ananya Vajpayee. I'll be back again next Monday. I hope you'll join me.
You can download many more BBC Radio 4 programmes for free. Find these at bbc.co.uk/Radio 4.